You know what's strange? We talk a lot about anxiety. We've got entire podcast libraries dedicated to it, therapy memes about it, whole corners of the internet built around naming it and managing it. But there's this one specific flavor of it that almost never gets its own spotlight. The kind that doesn't look like anxiety at all from the outside. It looks like someone who's fine, someone thoughtful, maybe a little quiet, someone who remembered exactly what you said 3 conversations ago. The person who overthinks conversations. Not the person who worries about the future in some vague, sweeping way, but the one who replays a Tuesday afternoon exchange on Thursday night at 2 a.m., turning it over and over like a stone they're not sure is ordinary or something rarer. The one who noticed the slight pause before you said, "Sounds good." The one who has already had 17 versions of a conversation they haven't had yet. And here's what almost nobody says about these people. They're not broken. They're not neurotic for sport. They're running software that was installed for a very specific reason, and understanding that reason changes everything about how you see them. Let's start where it usually starts, somewhere early. Picture a kid who learned, through experience rather than instruction, that words carry weight. Maybe the adults around them were unpredictable, not necessarily cruel, just inconsistent. A parent who was warm one afternoon and withdrawn the next, with no obvious explanation. A home where the emotional temperature shifted without warning, and you learned, quickly and quietly, to read the room, to catch signals before they became storms. You got very good at noticing things, the way someone's voice changed when they were actually annoyed versus when they said they weren't. The specific quality of a silence that was fine versus one that wasn't. That kind of vigilance doesn't just disappear when you grow up. It becomes your operating system. Psychologists have a term for the cognitive pattern that tends to develop in these circumstances. They call it hypervigilance to social cues. It's what happens when your nervous system has been trained, through repeated experience, to treat ambiguity as a potential threat. Not because you're paranoid, but because ambiguity once had real consequences. Your brain learned to close interpretive gaps before they could close badly, and it got very, very good at it. The result is someone who doesn't just hear what you said. They hear what you said, how you said it, what you didn't say, what you almost said, and what all of that might mean together. They're running parallel processing most people don't even know is possible. Here's what that actually looks like in practice. You send a message to someone who overthinks, and they respond quickly, maybe too quickly, because they already had a version of that response half composed in their head before you finished your thought. Or they don't respond quickly at all, because they're turning over the exact right phrasing, the one that lands warmly, without seeming too eager, clearly without sounding curt. They're not being difficult. They're being precise. Language matters to them the way measurements matter to an engineer. A few degrees off, and the whole thing can go sideways. They're also the people who will reference something you said months ago, casually, as if it was obvious. Because to them, it was stored immediately. Conversations with someone who matters to them don't blur together. They stay distinct and retrievable. This isn't because they're keeping score. It's because they were paying attention in a way that made the memory permanent. Neuroscience gives us a clue here. Research into emotional memory encoding suggests that information processed under heightened emotional arousal gets consolidated more deeply. Things that feel significant, uncertain, or interpersonally loaded get filed differently than neutral information. For someone who treats most conversations as significant by default, that filing system runs constantly. The brain isn't choosing to obsess, it's doing exactly what it was trained to do: retain everything that might matter later. But here's where it gets complicated. Because the very thing that makes them perceptive is also the thing that makes the replaying so exhausting. After a conversation ends, especially one that felt slightly off or unresolved, the processing doesn't stop. It continues on a kind of internal loop. Did I say that the wrong way? Did the pause mean something? Was the energy different at the end than it was at the beginning? The conversation is technically over, but it's still open, still being evaluated for anything that might have been missed. Psychologists sometimes describe this as post-event processing, a phenomenon well documented in research on social anxiety, where the mind conducts a detailed review after social interactions, scanning for evidence of failure or misread signals. But there's a meaningful distinction worth drawing here. For someone with acute social anxiety, that review is primarily about shame and judgment. For the chronic overthinker, it's often something different. It's more like quality control. More like a person who cares deeply about the relationship and wants to make sure they held up their end of it properly. That's a subtle but important difference. One is driven by fear of humiliation. The other is driven by something closer to devotion. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes with this. Not the exhaustion of doing too much, but the exhaustion of thinking too much about what you've done, of expending real cognitive and emotional energy on a conversation that the other person is almost certainly already forgotten. The asymmetry of it can be quietly lonely. You were fully there. You're still there. They've moved on to lunch. And the anticipatory side of it is its own landscape entirely. Before a difficult conversation, the overthinker has already had it, multiple times. They've mapped the most likely responses, prepared for the ones that could go sideways, and pre-processed enough of the emotional weight that when the actual conversation happens, they're strangely calm. People sometimes read this as indifference. It isn't. It's that the storm already passed internally. The conversation you're having with them is the aftermath of a much longer internal one. This is why overthinkers are often described as both deeply caring and oddly hard to read. They've already felt everything. By the time you see it, it's been through several rounds of editing. What's worth sitting with is how much of this behavior is relational at its core. Overthinkers aren't ruminating in a vacuum. They're ruminating about people, about connection, about whether they said the right thing, did right by someone, left someone with a good impression, not for vanity, but because the relationship genuinely matters. The cognitive machinery that looks like anxiety is, underneath it, often an expression of how seriously they take the people in their lives. Research published in the journal Cognitive Therapy and Research noted that repetitive thought patterns, while associated with increased distress, are also correlated with higher levels of empathy and social conscientiousness. The people most likely to replay conversations are also among the most likely to notice when someone else is struggling, to remember the details of what you're going through, to follow up when most people have forgotten to. The same mechanism that causes the looping is what makes them pay attention in the first place. It also makes them remarkably good at communication when they trust themselves enough to speak. Because they've thought so carefully about how words land, they tend to choose theirs deliberately. A message from an overthinker has usually been considered from multiple angles before you receive it. They're not rambling. They're precise. And when they ask you how you are, they actually want to know. They're not filling silence. Silence doesn't bother them. They're quite comfortable with it, having spent so much time inside their own heads. What does bother them is unresolved ambiguity between themselves and someone they care about. A conversation that ended on an unclear note. A relationship that's gone slightly quiet without explanation. These aren't small things to them. They're open loops. And open loops demand processing power until they're closed. If you know someone like this, and the odds are good that you do, because they're often the people you feel most seen by, there are a few things that help more than you might think. Directness is kind. If something is fine, say it's fine. If something isn't, say that too. The ambiguity is what costs them. Clear information, even uncomfortable information, is easier to work with than a vague signal they'll spend 3 days interpreting. And understanding the delay sometimes. When they take a moment before responding, it's not disinterest. They're finding the right words for what they actually mean. That's not a flaw. That's care. There's also something to be said for what these people bring to the spaces they inhabit. Every team, every friendship group, every family has someone who actually noticed when the dynamic shifted, who caught the thing nobody said out loud, who thought carefully about how a decision would affect everyone in the room, not just the most obvious person. That person is almost never the loudest. But they're often the reason things didn't go worse than they did. The overthinker in your life probably knows more about what you actually need than you've ever told them, because they've been paying attention since the beginning. There's a particular image that keeps coming to mind. Someone lying awake at midnight, not in crisis, not in despair, just quietly reviewing a conversation from earlier in the day, looking for the thing they almost said, or the thing they should have. Wondering if the other person is okay, wondering if they got it right. Outside it's quiet. Inside, it's anything but. What nobody tells these people often enough is that the very thing they're lying awake about, the caring, the attention, the need to get it right, is exactly what makes them rare. The world has plenty of people who don't think twice about what they said. The one turning it over at midnight is the one who took it seriously, who took you seriously. And that's something worth noticing. If this one landed for you, please consider subscribing. And if you want to support more of these deep dives into the quieter corners of human psychology, the join button is right there. It means more than you know. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing. These explorations take time to build carefully, and your support through the join button helps make them possible.